The deed was for 22 acres of bottomland in Point Coupee Parish, Louisiana. And the man who sold it needed the $180 more than he needed the land. That was the summer of 1931. Drought everywhere else in the country. Here in the parish, the problem ran the other direction. The 22 acres sat in a natural bowl between two low ridges, 1 mile east of the False River Oxbow, and it collected water the way a cupped hand collects rain. In a wet spring, it stood under 2 feet of standing water from March through June. In a dry summer, it went to black mud that sucked a boot off at the ankle. In a wet summer, it didn't go dry at all. The previous owner, a man named Arsenault, had tried pasture grass twice and hay once. Each attempt had drowned out in April and not come back. He'd put cattle on it in a dry year and watched them bog to the knee in August. He'd spent 11 years trying to make the land into something it didn't want to be, and he was done trying. He called it the sinkhole piece. Elroy Doucet was 39 years old, had farmed rented ground in Point Coupee Parish his entire adult life. Cotton mostly, a little sugarcane on the high ground, truck vegetables on the garden plot behind the house. He owned nothing, had owned nothing since his father's 40-acre place had gone for back taxes in 1919, when Elroy was 27 and didn't have the $94 to stop it. He paid Arsenault $180 from the coffee can above the kitchen cabinet and got a deed on paper that he folded into his shirt pocket. He drove to the sinkhole piece that evening and stood at the edge of the standing water. The water was the color of strong tea. Cypress knees broke the surface at the low end. Cattails along the north margin. A great blue heron stood at the far edge, perfectly still, watching him back. He was there an hour. Then he went home and started planning. His neighbors heard about the purchase through the ordinary channels that move information in a parish where everyone knows everyone's acreage and business. The response came in the form of a particular kind of silence. The silence that falls when people have decided something is too foolish to argue with directly. Doucet's nearest neighbor, a cotton farmer named Claire, who had land on both sides of the parish road, said he'd watched Arsenault try that piece for 11 years, and there was nothing that low ground would grow except mosquitoes. The extension agent from the LSU Agricultural College office in New Roads, a man named Fontenot who drove a black Ford pickup and visited the parish farms on a rotating schedule, stopped by in September of 1931 after hearing about the purchase. He walked the property edge, looked at the water line on the cypress bark, and told Doucet the parcel was classified as permanent wetland under the state's agricultural survey. He said the classification meant what Doucet was probably already thinking it meant. He said it politely. He said it clearly. He left a pamphlet on the truck seat about soil drainage programs available through the State Conservation Office. The drainage program required a minimum of 50 contiguous acres to qualify for assistance. Doucet had 22. He read the pamphlet. He put it on the shelf in the shed. What Fontenot didn't know, and what Doucet had been thinking through since the spring, when the idea had started forming itself around what he already understood about the parish's low ground, was that Doucet hadn't bought the piece to drain it. He'd bought it to flood it on purpose. He'd been watching rice. The Arkansas side of the rice belt ran 200 miles north and west of Point Coupee Parish, centered in the Grand Prairie country around Stuttgart. Doucet had a cousin by marriage who farmed 80 acres of rice there and had been farming it since the early 1920s. He'd visited in 1928 and spent 4 days watching the operation. The field preparation, the levee construction, the flooding schedule, the harvest. He'd asked questions the entire time. His cousin's wife had told her husband that Elroy asked more questions than any man she'd ever cooked for. He'd come home with 6 pages of handwritten notes and a 5-pound bag of seed rice his cousin had given him. Fortuna variety, the standard Arkansas short grain of the era. well adapted to controlled flood conditions. The notes went into the same coffee can as the savings. Rice needs flat ground, slow drainage, and water you can control. Water you can put in and take out on your schedule. Most of the parish didn't have that. The sinkhole piece had all three by accident of its own geography. The natural bowl between the two ridges held water reliably enough that Arsenault had cursed it for 11 years. The false river drainage to the west gave an outlet at the low end of the south ridge if you cut a controlled gate through it. The natural grade from north to south across the piece ran 8 inches of fall per 100 feet, shallow enough to flood evenly, enough fall to drain when you wanted it to. Doucet had measured the grade himself with a carpenter's level and a 12-foot board before he paid Arsenault the $180. He hadn't told Arsenault what he was measuring or why. He spent the fall of 1931 on levees. A rice paddy levee is not a dam. It is a low continuous ridge, 8 to 12 inches high, 2 feet wide at the base, running across the contour of the field to hold a uniform depth of water within each check. The checks fill from a head ditch and drain through a pipe or notched board gate in each levee. If the levees are right, the water depth across the check varies by less than 2 inches. If they are wrong, the grain stands in 8 inches of water on one end and dry ground on the other. Doucet laid out the levee lines with stakes and string, running them along contour lines he established with the carpenter's level and the 12-foot board. 6 levees across the 22 acres, dividing the piece into 7 checks. He built them with a slip scraper pulled by his mule, an old wood-beam Georgia stock he'd borrowed from Trosclair in exchange for a week of fence-building labor on Trosclair's north boundary. The levee work ran through October and into November. The ground was workable once the summer water receded. He shaped each levee by hand after the scraper roughed it in, using a flat spade to dress the shoulders and a tamper he'd made from a section of fence post with a crossbar nailed through it. 6 inches of packed earth, 2 feet at the base, topped flat. He built the head ditch along the north margin of the property, a shallow channel, 18 inches wide, fed from a sheet iron diversion box he cut into the natural drainage swale coming off the north ridge. When rain ran off the ridge, it would run into the head ditch and down through the levied checks in sequence. He cut the drain gate at the south end of the lowest check through the ridge into the false river drainage with a spade and a mattock over 3 days. In January of 1932, he opened the head ditch and watched water fill the upper check. It took 4 hours to reach a uniform 4-inch depth across the first check. He left it in overnight. The next morning, the water was still uniform. The levees had held. He drove to Trosclair's place and asked if he wanted to see something. Trosclair came back with him and looked at the flooded check for a while. He asked what Doucet was planning to put in it. Doucet said, rice. Trosclair looked at the water again. He drove home. The seed rice from the 1928 visit had been stored in a sealed tin in the shed through 3 Louisiana summers and a dry winter. He tested germination in February of 1932 by spreading 40 seeds on a wet cloth in a shallow pan on the kitchen windowsill. 31 sprouted in 4 days. 78% germination after 4 years of storage in a tin. Good enough. He soaked the remaining seed in a wash tub of water for 36 hours, then spread it to pre-sprout on burlap sacking in the shed for 2 days, until the radicle, the first root tip, had just broken the seed hull. Pre-sprouted seed sinks when broadcast into flooded ground. Dry seed floats and drifts to the levee edges. He broadcast the seed by hand into the flooded checks on April 14, 1932. Walking the levee tops, reaching into the canvas shoulder bag he'd sewn from a feed sack, casting the seed in even sweeps across the water surface. 80 pounds of seed across 22 acres. The pre-sprouted kernels settled through the water and lodged in the mud within the hour. He flooded to a 3-inch depth and left it. The seedlings were visible in 9 days. A green haze across the surface of the flooded checks, just below the waterline, the thread-thin shoots reaching toward the surface. He walked the levees every morning. The stand was even across most of the field, thin in 2 spots near the south check where the seed hadn't settled evenly, thick near the head ditch inlet where the broadcast had overlapped. He raised the water level as the plants grew, keeping the flood depth at 2 to 3 inches above the tallest leaves. The standard Arkansas management his cousin had described, the one that suppressed weed germination while the rice grew through it. Weeds need light to germinate. 2 inches of water over the leaves kept the light from any weed seed trying to start below the rice canopy. Trosclair drove past the field road twice in May. He didn't stop. Fontenot, the extension agent, stopped in late May on his parish rotation. He stood at the levee edge and looked at the flooded checks. The rice was knee-high. The stand was dense and green, the flood surface dark between the rows. He asked several questions about the levee construction and the seed source. He wrote in his notebook. He didn't say it was going to work. He didn't say it wasn't. He drove to his next stop. The flood came in June. Not Doucet's flood. The False Rivers. 3 days of rain starting June 8th put 8 inches in the rain gauge at the New Roads Courthouse. The False River came up 4 feet and backfilled through the drain gate at the bottom of the sinkhole piece. Doucet's carefully managed 3-inch flood depth went to 14 inches overnight. At 14 inches, the rice was submerged, not flooded to the growth tip, but under. The upper 3 checks, draining to the south, had no outlet. The water simply rose. He pulled the boards from the drain gate at the south end and let the False River push what it was going to push. There was nothing else to do. The water stayed high for 9 days. On the 10th day, he walked the levees with a cane pole to gauge the depth. The lowest check was still at 11 inches. He could see rice plants below the surface, bent, pressed flat by the current that had moved through, but still green. Still green. He watched the water drop over the following week. By June 25th, the lowest check was at 4 inches. The rice had straightened. Not completely. The plants that had been pressed flat had a cant to them, leaning south the direction the current had run. But they were upright. They were growing. The flood had taken his levee boards at the north inlet and packed silt against the south gate. It had cost him 4 days of repair work in the mud. It had not taken the crop. Trosclair stopped at the field road on the last day of June and looked at the leaning but standing rice. He asked if it was going to make anything. Doucet said he thought so. Trosclair drove on. The rice headed in late August. The panicles, the seed-bearing tops, emerged from the boot leaf and arched over with the weight of the filling grain over the following 3 weeks. Doucet walked the checks and counted heads per square foot in 6 spots across the field. He wrote the counts in his notebook, averaged them, multiplied by the stand density and the weight per panicle from his cousin's notes. His back of the notebook estimate, between 28 and 34 bushels per acre. He had nothing to harvest it with. His cousin in Arkansas had described the harvest methods in 1928. Large Arkansas operations used grain binders and stationary threshers, the same equipment that handled wheat and oats. Small operations cut by hand with a rice hook and threshed against a barrel. Doucet was 22 acres. That was neither a large operation nor a small one exactly. He borrowed a grain binder from a German farmer named Schexnayder in the next parish, who grew a small acreage of wheat and had the equipment standing idle in September. The arrangement was 2 days of Doucet's labor at Schexnayder's place in exchange for the binder loan. He cut the rice standing in the drained checks. He'd dropped the water 2 weeks before harvest, letting the field surface firm, running the borrowed binder behind his mule. The machine laid the rice in bundles. He and his son Ferris, 14 that fall, set them in shocks across the field to cure for 10 days. He threshed with a flail on a tarpaulin stretched across the barn floor. 2 weeks of evenings, Ferris on one flail, Elroy on the other, working opposite sides of each bundle, the grain raining down onto the tarp with each stroke. Old method, slow method. The only method he had. The grain went into cotton sacks. He weighed the sacks on the cotton scale in the barn, 690 pounds per acre, 11.5 bushels per acre. His estimate had been 28 to 34. He sat with the scale numbers for a while. The flood in June had pressed the stand flat for 9 days. The plants that had leaned south after straightening had developed their panicles at an angle. The grain had still formed, but the head count per plant was down, the fill weight per head was down, the harvestable portion of the field was down at the south end where the backflow had run deepest. 11.5 bushels per acre was not a failed crop. It was a reduced crop. The field had produced 253 bushels of rice from 22 acres in the first season, with a flood event in June that had put the plants under for 9 days, on ground that had been written off by its previous owner as fit for nothing. He sold 200 bushels to a rice mill in Baton Rouge at $0.82 per bushel. He kept 53 bushels for seed, $164 in gross revenue. He had paid $180 for the land. He wrote the numbers in the notebook and looked at them. Then he started planning the drain gate modification to prevent the backflow problem. The drain gate in 1933 was a flap valve, a hinged sheet iron plate that opened inward under the pressure of outflowing water and closed against a wooden frame when outside water pressure exceeded inside pressure. He built it himself over 4 days in March from sheet iron bought at the hardware store in New Roads. Cost, $8.40 for the iron, $1.10 for hardware. The False River came up in May of 1933. Not as high as June of 1932, but it came up. The flap valve closed against the frame. The backflow stopped. Doucet's managed flood held at depth. The 1933 crop, 22 bushels per acre, 484 bushels total, sold 400 bushels at $0.78 per bushel, kept 84 for seed. The 1934 crop, 27 bushels per acre, 594 bushels. By 1934, Fontenot was stopping at the field road every month during the growing season. He had started including the Doucet operation in his parish reports to the LSU Extension Office. He had also, quietly, begun directing questions from other parish farmers who had low ground they didn't know what to do with, in Doucet's direction. Doucet answered every question that came to him. He showed anyone who wanted to see it the levee layout, the head ditch, the flap valve gate. He let 2 farmers walk the checks during the growing season to see what a flooded stand looked like at each growth stage. He didn't charge for any of this. He was building something he could see forming, even if no one else could see it yet. By 1937, 6 years after the $180 purchase, Elroy Doucet was selling rice to mills serving Pointe Coupee, West Baton Rouge, Iberville, Avoyelles, and St. Landry parishes. His own ground was still 22 acres, but he'd taken on custom planting contracts on 6 other low-ground parcels in the parish that their owners couldn't use for conventional crops, parcels that sat idle or in poor pasture, worth little to their owners and nothing to a conventional operation. He managed the flooding and harvest on each under a share arrangement. 2/3 to the landowner, 1/3 to Doucet for inputs and management. The managed acreage by the summer of 1937, 22 acres owned, 118 acres under contract, 140 acres total. 1937 yield, averaged across all managed ground, 31 bushels per acre. Total production, 340 bushels. His gross from rice that year, $3,128. Trosclair stopped at the field road in August of 1937 and watched a hired crew shocking rice on the North Check. He asked Doucet how many acres he was running. Doucet told him. Trosclair looked at the field for a while. He asked if there was low ground in the parish he hadn't already contracted. Doucet said there was some. Trosclair asked where. Doucet said he'd let him know if anything came available. Trosclair drove on. Fontenot filed a formal case study with the LSU Agricultural Extension Service in Baton Rouge in the fall of 1937. 12 pages. He documented the 1931 purchase, the levee and gate construction, the seed source, the 1932 flood event and recovery, and the yield progression from 1932 through 1937. He described the flap valve gate design in enough detail that another farmer could build one from the description alone. He included Doucet's per-acre yield data against the Arkansas Gulf Coast average for the same years. Doucet's 6-year average, 24 bushels per acre. Arkansas Gulf Coast average for the same period, 26 bushels per acre, on ground that had been written off as permanent wetland, on ground that cost $180. Elroy Doucet farmed rice in Point Coupee Parish through 1961. 30 years from the summer, he paid Arsenault and folded the deed into his shirt pocket. He was 69 years old when he stopped. His son Ferris took the operation, the 22 acres and the contracts both. Though the contract acreage had changed over the decades, some parcels falling away as owners sold and others coming in as the reputation of the management approach spread through the parish. The flap valve gate on the drain at the south end of the sinkhole piece was replaced in 1948 after the iron had corroded through at the hinge. Ferris built the replacement from the same design, same hardware store and new roads. He built it in 4 days, the same as his father had built the first one. The 22 acres still grows rice. Different owner now. Ferris's grandson sold the parcel in 2001. The levee lines run the same contour Elroy established with the carpenter's level and the 12-foot board in the fall of 1931. The head ditch is in the same position along the north margin. The grade from north to south is the same grade, 8 inches per 100 feet, the measurement Doucet made before he paid Arsenault the $180. Arsenault had called it the sinkhole piece. He'd been right about what it was. He'd been wrong about what that meant. The water comes every spring. It always has. The difference is, who's deciding where it goes?